I always said the hardest thing to find is a perfect white shirt. Right. You know, every man is looking for the perfect white shirt. None of us found it today.
This is a white shirt. You can see how it's folded.
So the opera is a white shirt.
My name is Kjetil Thorsen. I'm an architect, founder and partner of Smedt Architects in Oslo. And we've done this building.
My name is Julien De Smedt and I've built this ski jump in Oslo.
Gary Bates, Space Group Architects. We're working on the Oslo Central Station project. Here with Julien De Smedt and Kjetil Thorsen, checking out Oslo. What I always admired about the opera, I came here 12 years ago, and what it actually did is it opened up a part of the city that now is under radical development.
I think even more important, Gary, is that it's basically this space is non-commercial. New Oslo is not necessarily commercial.
Definitely not, and I think, but that's
you have the money not to make it commercial.
That's exactly the right. The money not to make it commercial.
Commercial is always vertical. Cultural is always horizontal.
You know, it's back to the question of density. Yeah, in Norway, you have so much damn space that maybe you can always justify a kind of horizontal cultural occupation. But
in this discussion of density is actually that this building's density is not quantified. There is no tools today to quantify what is the density of this building. It's a public space, and when you introduce that into the equation, you kind of blur the whole system of quantification. And there's no say yet what is the impact of the building on its environment, because the environment isn't finished. But what you can see is that it's already been taken over, basically.
Yeah. I would foresee a lot of architecture in the future which needs to be public, functioning more like parks. You enter them from a lot of sides, you penetrate through them, you walk all over them. They're operating like parks. Whereas the commercial aspects, they need smaller footprints and increased traditional density, because that's how you calculate the cost, that's how you calculate the money and how you make the money.
You know, a lot of people are talking about that and saying, it's a wall to the city, and use the word commercial. And of course, if we all came here and said, those are all schools, high schools, for education for the future and innovation of the cities, filled with children's barnhagens, kind of kindergartens on the ground floor, and culture on the top floors with views over the fjord, everyone would be completely silent.
These buildings still have a major job to do, and that is to provide the public with spaces they don't have to pay for.
As we could discuss these additive projects, we could just as well discuss a kind of demolition plan for Oslo, because I think there's a good 30-40% of the city that could easily be kind of demolished and rethought.
We believe, I guess, that we all believe in kind of densifying cities and not, spreading cities horizontally. So where would they actually go in this city?
So there is no question that utilizing a long water line is a unique situation for Oslo, and I think it should be utilized.
But actually, the nice thing now is this idea of the linear city that's kind of evolving, where you have this kind of 7-kilometer stretch along the waterfront here, and there are no centers. There are kind of gravitation points. You have the castle, and you have the city hall, and you have some different things. But essentially now, it's maybe one of the few places in the world where it's actually able to develop, 100 years later, and kind of imagine itself and imagine its relationship to the water.
Some cities, like Oslo, like Trieste, like Hamburg, are designed from the water, not from the backlands. Only when it came back to looking towards the fjord, the actual structure of the city came back in.
But frankly, the housing stock in Oslo is shit.
It is.
You have the workers' quarters, which where most of the people I know live, because that's what they can afford, which are designed, when the factories were running along the Akerselva River there, and the quality is just horrific and needs largely to be rebuilt.
Maybe now it's also like an emerging demand for this variety, and that will grow. I don't know.
You see the
fact
example.
That you're complaining.
The example of variety is, say, Sjuholmen, for example, which is being built, which was a project that Kjetil won next to Aker Brygge. Yeah, you're right. The waterfront is being developed, but the risk of the waterfront being developed is that you're just going to get a lot of kind of ghettos. Except they're not going to be a ghetto in the traditional sense. They'll be people 50, 60, 70 without kids, in their silver years, let's say, small little art galleries in the ground floor. And there'll also be monochromatic areas.
Did you ever discuss if this is the right location for a train station, main train station in Oslo? After, let's say, it expands with more than 20%. The suggestion was to move it much further northeast.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's a nice feature of Oslo to have this really hyper central, kind of the bottom of the valley kind of node of access. I mean, especially for people like me who comes from outside all the time. And from the airport, you get this immediate injection.
It's also a kind of meeting space between every single type of kind of traveler, commuter, people are passing through, tourists and locals, and the neighborhoods that directly butt up against it. So for us, it's a perfect project to deal with a lot of the issues that we were talking about. Of course, they're Gordian knots. They take forever. They take a long time. It's a 2-year political process just discussing it. But now it's going to go ahead. I mean, these projects have a natural pressure driving them, and that's the pressure of growth. Probably a disaster in contemporary housing planning.
We have to be careful not to criticize something because it's not appealing to us as architects.
There's something about the constellation of probably too little mix, I guess. I don't know what you guys think, but to me it seems like, okay, we have ghettoification of housing. We're not able to spend money wisely. How do you budget a building properly today with mixed functions? Yeah. Maybe even vertical, separated mixed functions, not necessarily sandwich mixed functions. Yeah, everybody loves that. But even vertically mixed. Maybe by the politics of the sites. You must know better than anyone in Amsterdam. The urban development was based on a political decision on how the sites were distributed.
Maybe what is more significant in the Netherlands is that the kind of hyperdensity of the need of hyperdensity, due to the kind of shortage of space, has created the need for all these kind of more complex structures.
Inventiveness.
Of mix.
This is basically what Barcode is trying to do.
Yeah.
Subscribe the spaces to each plot, and by that generating typical architecture.
Yeah.
So maybe here is just a mistake of the site more than the architecture. I don't know.
The dilemma is that these places are purely spec-driven. I mean, purely. Right. The size of the balcony, you can be sure it's not 1 centimeter more than.
Okay, so maybe the conclusion is that yes, it's cheaper than the rest, but they're still paying too much.
And I agree with what you're saying, Julien. Whether to what extent do you judge the architecture in terms of what you like, but I think we have a certain obligation to be critical of the architecture as well as the space that the architecture generates. And you and I, coming from Holland, have seen 1,000 of these projects, and of this 1,000, we've seen 990 better.
We're not opening up a lot of these type of things because they seem to be commercially too important for the clients.
We did 12 competitions in Norway before we won the 13th one, the Holmenkollen ski jump. It's interesting to look at the 12 that we lost and sort of analyze a little bit why we lost them. Every time the projects selected were painfully conservative.
But what they mainly are lacking, in my opinion, is some intelligence. I don't think they're intelligent. You can argue for a qualified good box if you want to.
Yeah, sure.
Crafting wise or whatever. But it's never going to be anything more, is it?
I was actually wondering because we've had this question before, the kind of power of Holmenkollen in terms of the symbolics of it. Is it really so that this location has such a meaning for people?
It's mythical. It's deeply embedded in the Norwegian soul. And Norwegians have this thing of gathering and being very proud of certain things that we think we have developed or generated. And the Holmenkollen is one of them. This is the Oslo representation of us discovering the North Pole, the South Pole, winning every race.
Well, then that goes back to the discussion we had before about the domesticity of the old jump, that you had a jump sitting on top of an office building. There was something, that mystical effect for me was somehow diminished by the fact that you had someone sitting in their office typing invoices.
Some of the people you've dealt with are these kind of self-made outdoor types. You know, the first ski jumps they probably built themselves as they were children. You know? So they're used to doing things sort of scrap on, making decisions in a totally different manner. So that means postponing decisions until they become absolutely necessary.
I mean, now everyone's talking about slow cooked food. You know, you take a very stiff piece of meat and cook it for 4 or 5 hours in the oven until it becomes, melt. If you have the patience and if you have the resources, which we clearly do, that you can facilitate a process that in the end will get the right people on the table sooner or later.
But there's one thing you need to take into account when you do slow cooking, and that is low temperature.
Low temperature.
So you can't.
I agree.
You can't have a heated commercial society happening within a slow cooking urban development.
They started Tromsø in 1991. 20 years later now, we're still discussing Tromsø and the terminal there.
But Tromsø is especially slow.
Tromsø is especially slow, but the meat is especially tender.